Imagine waking up tomorrow in a world where the Roman Empire never collapsed. Not the ancient Rome you read about in history books, but a living, breathing superpower that evolved continuously for over 2,000 years. Picture yourself walking down streets where Latin is still spoken as commonly as English, where Roman architecture hasn't been relegated to museums but continues to dominate skylines from Britain to the Middle East, where the political systems that govern billions of people today trace an unbroken line back to the Senate of Julius Caesar's time. What would our technology look like? What would our religions be? Would democracy as we know it even exist? Would the United States of America have ever been founded? These aren't just hypothetical questions. They're windows into understanding how fragile and contingent our entire modern world really is. Every smartphone you hold, every democratic election you participate in, every cultural tradition you cherish exists because of a specific sequence of historical events that began when Rome fell. Change that one domino and everything changes. Everything. So buckle up, because over the next several minutes, we're going on a journey through an alternate timeline that will make you question everything you thought you knew about progress, civilization, and human destiny itself. And I promise you, by the end of this documentary, you'll never look at the modern world the same way again. Let's start with the most fundamental question. Why did Rome actually fall? Understanding this is crucial because we need to know what we're preventing in our alternate timeline. The traditional date given for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 AD, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. But calling this the fall is actually misleading. Rome didn't fall in a day. It crumbled over centuries through a complex web of economic decline, military pressures, political instability, disease, climate change, and cultural transformation. The empire was too large to govern effectively with ancient technology. Communication between Rome and distant provinces took weeks or months. Tax collection became inefficient and corrupt. The military became increasingly dependent on Germanic mercenaries who had little loyalty to Roman ideals. Inflation devastated the economy. Plagues swept through population centers, and perhaps most importantly, the very idea of what it meant to be Roman became diluted and contested. Now imagine all of these problems were somehow solved or managed differently. Imagine Roman engineers developed better transportation and communication technologies earlier. Imagine political reforms created a more stable and efficient system of governance. Imagine the military remained a disciplined, loyal force of Roman citizens rather than barbarian mercenaries. Imagine economic policies prevented the devastating inflation that crippled the late empire. This is the branching point of our alternate history. From here, everything diverges. In our alternate timeline, let's say that around 400 AD, a series of visionary emperors implemented sweeping reforms that addressed the core weaknesses of the empire. They decentralized administration, creating a system of regional governance that allowed for local flexibility within a unified framework. Think of it as an early version of federalism, where provinces had significant autonomy but remained bound to Rome through shared identity, economic integration, and military alliance. This prevented the fragmentation that plagued the actual late empire. Communication technology advanced through a combination of better roads, relay stations, and perhaps even an early form of semaphore system for rapid, long-distance signaling. These improvements allowed the central government to respond to crises faster and maintain better control over distant territories. The military underwent transformation as well. Instead of relying on unreliable mercenaries, the reformed Roman army maintained its discipline and loyalty through better pay, land grants, and a renewed sense of Roman identity that incorporated rather than excluded various ethnic groups within the empire. The concept of being Roman evolved to become less about ethnic origin and more about cultural citizenship. If you spoke Latin, followed Roman law, participated in Roman civic life, and contributed to the empire, you were Roman. This inclusive identity helped bind together diverse populations in a way the historical empire failed to achieve in its final centuries. With political stability and military security established, the Roman economy could flourish. Trade networks that historically collapsed after Rome's fall would instead expand and deepen. The Mediterranean would remain a unified economic zone, but more than that, Roman commerce would push further into Asia, deeper into Africa, and across the Atlantic much earlier than in our timeline. Why? Because a stable, wealthy empire invests in exploration and trade expansion. Roman ships, building on centuries of accumulated maritime knowledge, would become increasingly sophisticated. By the year 1000 AD in our alternate timeline, Roman vessels might very well have reached the Americas, establishing contact and trade with indigenous civilizations nearly 500 years before Columbus. Let's think about what this means. The Columbian Exchange, that massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between the Old World and the New World that fundamentally reshaped both hemispheres, would have happened differently and earlier. Instead of Spanish conquistadors arriving with horses, guns, and smallpox in the 1500s and devastating indigenous empires, you might have had Roman merchants and explorers arriving in the year 1000 with different technologies, different diseases, and different intentions. The Roman approach to conquest was typically to incorporate and assimilate rather than completely destroy. They were empire builders who wanted productive provinces, not empty land. So the fate of American indigenous peoples might have been dramatically different. There still would have been disease, still would have been conquest, still would have been suffering, but the pattern and outcome would have been unlike anything that actually happened. Back in Europe and the Mediterranean, the religious landscape would look completely different. In our actual history, Christianity became the dominant religion of Europe, partly because it filled the vacuum left by Rome's collapse. The Catholic Church became the inheritor of Roman administrative genius, preserving Latin, maintaining records, and providing a unifying identity across fractured European kingdoms. But in our alternate timeline where Rome never fell, Christianity would have developed within a continuous Roman context. The Great Schism between Catholic and Orthodox churches in 1054 might never have happened because the political divisions that caused it wouldn't exist. The Protestant Reformation in the 1500s would have unfolded completely differently, if at all. Why? Because many of the grievances that fueled the Reformation were tied to the corruption and political entanglements of a Catholic Church that had become a temporal power in its own right after Rome's fall. In a world where Rome continued, the Church might have remained more clearly subordinate to imperial authority, changing its entire trajectory. Even more intriguing, other religions might have maintained stronger footholds in this alternate Roman world. Historical Rome was remarkably tolerant of diverse religious practices as long as they didn't threaten public order or imperial authority. A continuously evolving Roman Empire might have seen Christianity, traditional Roman paganism, various Eastern mystery religions, Judaism, and eventually Islam coexisting within a pluralistic framework. Imagine major cities in this alternate timeline, with Christian churches, Jewish synagogues, temples to Jupiter and Mithras, and Islamic mosques all operating within blocks of each other, all protected under Roman law. The religious conflicts that tore Europe apart for centuries in our timeline might have been moderated by a strong imperial authority that valued stability and tax revenue over theological purity. Speaking of Islam, the rise of this religion in the 600s AD would have encountered a very different political landscape. In actual history, Islamic armies exploded out of Arabia and conquered vast territories, partly because the Byzantine and Persian empires had exhausted themselves fighting each other. But in our timeline, a strong, unified Roman Empire would present a much more formidable obstacle. This doesn't mean Islam wouldn't spread, but it might have spread more through conversion and trade rather than conquest. You might have seen a slower, more gradual Islamization of certain Roman provinces, with Islam eventually becoming one of several major religions within the empire, rather than the foundation of a rival civilization. The cultural flowering of the Islamic Golden Age, with its advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, might have occurred within Roman universities and libraries, creating a fusion of Roman and Islamic learning that would accelerate technological and scientific progress. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of our alternate timeline: technological development. In actual history, the fall of Rome led to what used to be called the Dark Ages, though historians now recognize this period was more complex and less uniformly dark than once believed. Still, there's no question that the collapse of Roman infrastructure, trade networks, and urban civilization led to a decline in technological sophistication in many areas. Aqueducts fell into disrepair, roads crumbled, literacy declined, large-scale organization and engineering became rare. In our alternate timeline where Rome never fell, this regression never happens. Instead, you have continuous technological development built on accumulated Roman engineering knowledge. Roman concrete technology, which produced structures like the Pantheon that still stand today, would continue to advance. By the medieval period in our timeline, Roman engineers in the alternate timeline might be building structures that wouldn't look out of place in the early Industrial Revolution. Steam power, which the ancient Greeks actually experimented with in the form of Hero's engine, but never developed for practical use, might have been seriously explored by Roman engineers looking for ways to pump water, operate mills, or power machinery. Think about what continuous technological development means. In our actual history, humanity went from the fall of Rome around 500 AD to the beginning of the scientific revolution around 1500 AD, 1,000 years, with relatively slow technological progress compared to what came before or after. Now remove that 1,000-year slowdown, add 1,000 years of continuous development to Roman engineering, medicine, mathematics, and natural philosophy. By the time we reach the equivalent of the year 1500 in our alternate timeline, this never-fallen Roman Empire might be approaching technology levels that our timeline didn't reach until 1800 or even later. Industrial machinery powered by water wheels or early steam engines might be common in Roman factories. Roman physicians might have microscopes and a germ theory of disease. Roman natural philosophers might have developed something resembling the scientific method centuries earlier than Francis Bacon and René Descartes did in our timeline. But here's where things get really interesting, and maybe a little unsettling. This alternate Rome wouldn't just be technologically advanced, it would be politically and culturally different in ways that might make modern people uncomfortable. Rome was an empire, an autocracy that subordinated individual freedom to collective order and state power. The democratic traditions that eventually flowered in Western civilization emerged partly from the fragmentation that followed Rome's fall. Medieval kingdoms, Renaissance city-states, and Enlightenment thinkers all developed political theories in contexts where no single overwhelming power dominated. They could experiment with different forms of government, different relationships between rulers and ruled, different theories of rights and liberty. In our alternate timeline, none of this fragmentation happens. The Roman Empire remains the overwhelming political reality for everyone within its borders and most people beyond them. Roman law, which influenced Western legal traditions even in our timeline, would be the only legal tradition for vast populations. The concept of natural rights, the social contract, representative government, and all the other ideas that underpin modern democracy might never develop, at least not in the forms we know. Why would they? If you live in a world where the Roman system has been successful for over 1,000 years, why would you question it? Why would you risk the stability and prosperity it provides for abstract political experiments? This creates a fascinating paradox. Our alternate Roman world might be wealthier, more technologically advanced, more peaceful, and more culturally sophisticated than the fractured medieval world that actually existed. But it might also be less free, at least in terms of political participation and individual rights as we understand them today. Roman citizenship brought obligations as well as privileges. The state demanded loyalty, military service, and respect for authority. Dissent was tolerated only up to a point. In a continuous Roman Empire that never experienced the fragmentation and political experimentation of post-Roman Europe, you might have a world that's more orderly and efficient, but also more authoritarian. Now let's jump forward to what would be the equivalent of the age of exploration in our timeline. We already established that Romans probably reached the Americas much earlier. But what happens when Roman technology reaches a level comparable to European technology in the 1400s and 1500s? In our actual history, European voyages of discovery were driven partly by competition between rival kingdoms and by the desire to find trade routes to Asia that bypassed the Ottoman Empire. In the alternate timeline, you don't have rival European kingdoms, you have Roman provinces. And you might not have an Ottoman Empire at all, or if you do, it might be contained or incorporated into the Roman sphere. So the motives for exploration would be different, but the capabilities would be there, possibly even more advanced than in our timeline. Roman ships might circumnavigate the globe earlier, map ocean currents and trade winds more systematically, and establish a truly global empire centuries before Britain did in our timeline. By the year 1500 in the alternate timeline, you might have Roman governors administering provinces in the Americas, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. The entire world might be bound together in a single political and economic system centered on the Mediterranean and Rome. This would have profound implications for every culture on Earth. Languages that developed independently in our timeline might have Latin vocabulary and grammar imposed on them. Legal systems that evolved separately would be replaced by Roman law. Architectural styles, religious practices, artistic traditions, and social customs would all bear Roman influence or be entirely supplanted by Roman norms. The question that should be troubling you by now is this: would this be progress? On one hand, you'd have a world with less warfare, since there would be fewer independent powers to fight each other. You'd have a world with more stable trade, better infrastructure, and more rapid technological advancement. Global problems like piracy, slavery, or epidemic disease could be addressed by a single coordinating authority with the resources to actually do something about them. On the other hand, you'd have less cultural diversity, less political freedom, less room for experimentation and innovation that comes from having multiple independent societies trying different approaches to similar problems. And we haven't even talked about the most dramatic implication of all. The United States of America would never exist. Think about that. The entire concept of America as a nation was born from British colonization and the later rebellion of those colonies against the British Crown. In a world where Rome never fell, there would be no Britain as we know it, no independent European kingdoms competing for colonial possessions, no tradition of parliamentary democracy and Enlightenment political thought that inspired the American founders. The territory that we call the United States might be just another set of Roman provinces. governed by Roman-appointed officials, populated by Latin-speaking citizens whose identity was bound to an empire on the other side of the Atlantic. American exceptionalism, that sense that the United States represents something unique and special in human history, would be meaningless in this alternate world because America as a distinct nation would never have come into being. The ideals enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, documents that have inspired democratic movements around the world, might never have been written. Would someone else, somewhere else, have eventually articulated similar ideas about human rights and self-government? Maybe, but maybe not, or at least not in the same way or with the same impact. This brings us face to face with a profound historical truth. Our modern world, with all its freedoms, all its problems, all its potential, exists because Rome fell. The collapse of that ancient superpower, as traumatic and destructive as it was for the people who lived through it, created space for new civilizations, new ideas, and new possibilities to emerge. Medieval Europe, for all its faults, was a laboratory of political experimentation. Kingdoms, city-states, merchant republics, theocracies, and feudal principalities all coexisted and competed, each trying different approaches to governance, economics, and social organization. This diversity and competition eventually produced the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the democratic revolutions that shaped our modern world. Would a continuous Roman Empire have produced its own Renaissance and Enlightenment? Would Roman thinkers have eventually developed ideas about natural rights, limited government, and popular sovereignty? It's possible. Rome was capable of remarkable adaptability and innovation, but the specific historical circumstances that produced Leonardo da Vinci, Martin Luther, John Locke, and Thomas Jefferson wouldn't exist in the alternate timeline. Different circumstances would produce different thinkers with different ideas. The world they would create might be equally rich and complex, but it would be fundamentally different from ours in ways we can barely imagine. Consider technology one more time. We've talked about how a continuous Roman Empire might be more technologically advanced, but what kind of technology would they develop? In our timeline, industrial capitalism drove technological innovation in particular directions, creating machines for mass production, weapons for warfare between competing nations, and consumer goods for increasingly wealthy middle classes. Roman priorities would be different. They might focus more on monumental architecture, military technology for maintaining their vast empire, and engineering projects like roads, aqueducts, and harbors that benefit collective infrastructure rather than individual consumption. You might have a world with stunning public works and efficient transportation, but without the consumer cornucopia that defines modern capitalism. Would that be better or worse? It depends on your values and what you think makes life worth living. And what about science? The scientific revolution in our timeline emerged from a complex mix of factors including Renaissance humanism, Protestant emphasis on individual interpretation, competition between European universities and royal courts, and the gradual separation of natural philosophy from theology. In the alternate Roman timeline, the institutional context for scientific inquiry would be completely different. You might have science developing within Roman imperial academies funded by the state for practical purposes like improving agriculture, engineering, and military technology. This might produce rapid advances in some fields while neglecting others that don't have obvious practical applications. Or you might have science remaining subordinate to philosophy and theology in a way that slows its development compared to our timeline. It's impossible to know for sure, but what's certain is that it would be different. Let's think about what this alternate world would look like today, in 2026. Imagine you're watching this video, but instead of watching it in whatever country you're actually in right now, you're watching it as a citizen of the Roman Empire. What would your life be like? You'd probably speak Latin as your first language, though you might also know Greek and whatever local language is spoken in your province. You'd learn Roman history in school, studying an unbroken line of emperors stretching back over 2,000 years. You'd participate in Roman civic rituals and festivals that blend ancient traditions with whatever evolved over the centuries. You'd pay taxes to Roman authorities, serve in the Roman military if called, and follow Roman law in your daily affairs. Your sense of identity would be tied to being part of something vast and ancient, a civilization that has endured longer than any other in human history. But would you be free in any meaningful sense? Would you have a voice in how you're governed? Would you be able to criticize the government without fear? Would you have the rights and protections that citizens of modern democracies take for granted? These are uncomfortable questions because the answers might be no, at least not in the way we understand these things today. And yet, you might also live in a world with less poverty, less disease, better infrastructure, and more stability than our actual 2026. You might look at our timeline's history of nationalism, world wars, genocides, and environmental destruction, and think that your continuous Roman world, for all its limitations, has avoided some of humanity's worst impulses by maintaining order and unity. Or maybe, just maybe, the continuous Roman Empire would have evolved over its 2,000+ years of existence. Maybe the static autocracy of ancient Rome would have gradually transformed into something more participatory and rights-based, driven by the same human desires for dignity, autonomy, and political voice that fueled democratic movements in our timeline. Maybe by 2026, in the alternate timeline, the Roman Empire would be a constitutional monarchy or even a democratic federation, maintaining Roman identity and institutions while embracing principles of liberty and self-government. That's the optimistic version of this alternate history. The pessimistic version is a world-spanning authoritarian state with unimaginable surveillance and control capabilities, using advanced technology to maintain power in ways that ancient emperors could only dream of. The truth is, we can't know which version would have come to pass because history is not deterministic. Small choices, random events, and individual human actions can push civilizations in radically different directions. What we can know is that the world would be unrecognizably different. Everything from the languages you speak to the food you eat, from the religion you practice to the government that rules you, from the technology you use to the ideas you take for granted about justice, freedom, and human potential, would all be shaped by the fact that Rome never fell. And here's the final, most mind-bending implication. You wouldn't exist. Not you specifically, but the specific individual consciousness reading these words right now. Your existence depends on a chain of causation that includes your parents' meeting, your grandparents' meeting, and on back through generations. Change any significant historical event and people meet different partners, have children at different times, and the specific combination of genetic material that makes you wouldn't occur. Some other person would exist in your place, living a life in that alternate Roman world, but it wouldn't be you. In the most literal sense, the fall of Rome was necessary for your existence. Every person alive today exists only because history unfolded exactly as it did, including Rome's fall. It's a strange thought, but it underscores how intimately connected we all are to the grand sweep of history, even events that happened 1,500 years before we were born. So what would happen if the Roman Empire never fell? We'd have a world that's alien to us in almost every conceivable way. It might be richer or poorer, freer or more oppressed, more or less technologically advanced, more peaceful or more violent than our actual world. The only certainty is that it would be different, so profoundly different that we struggle even to imagine it clearly. And that tells us something important about our own world. The modern civilization we inhabit, with all its wonders and horrors, all its triumphs and failures, is not inevitable. It emerged from specific historical circumstances, including the fall of Rome, and could easily have turned out otherwise. We are the products of contingency, living in one possible branch of history's infinite tree of possibilities. Understanding this doesn't change our world, but it might change how we see it, making us more humble about our achievements, more aware of our fragility, and more appreciative of the unlikely series of events that brought us to this moment. The Roman Empire fell, and in that collapse, space opened for the world we know to come into being. Whether that was ultimately good or bad is a question each person has to answer for themselves, but one thing is certain: it matters. History matters. The choices of people long dead echo through centuries and shape the lives of people yet unborn. And that means our choices matter too. What we do today, the civilizations we build or tear down, the technologies we develop, the values we embrace or reject, all of these will shape worlds we'll never see, creating realities that people hundreds or thousands of years from now will take for granted as inevitable, never realizing how easily things could have been different. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think? Would you want to live in a world where Rome never fell? Do you think we'd be better off or worse off? What aspects of our modern world do you value most, and would they exist in that alternate timeline? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you'd like, tell me where in the world you're watching this video from. Your comment is important, and I want to read and respond to it. For more exciting stories like this, click on the video that's playing on your screen right now.